All right, get ready for a deep dive. We're going to crack a medical case wide open, using the OpenStax microbiology textbook, of course. There's a link to it in the video description if you want to play detective along with us. By the way, it's a fictional case study, just to be clear. But it's a great example of how real-world microbiology works.
Yeah, what's really cool is that this case, it shows how something like a normal vacation can suddenly become all about microbes and stuff.
Exactly. So picture this, okay? You're a doctor, and you have a patient, 22 years old, named Alex, who's just back from spring break, Mexico. He didn't come back with souvenirs, though. He brought back, some pretty nasty stomach problems, abdominal cramps, watery diarrhea, the works.
Yeah, so medically speaking, it sounds like classic gastroenteritis. But the tricky part is figuring out what's causing it, right? Could be bacteria, could be viruses, even protozoa, who knows?
And the textbook, it throws a whole bunch of suspects at us. There's E. coli, Vibrio cholerae, Campylobacter, Salmonella. Then there are the viruses like rotavirus and norovirus. Oh, and we can't forget about the protozoa, Giardia, and Cryptosporidium. It's like a whole lineup of potential culprits.
It really is. And just like a detective, the doctor needs clues to narrow down the suspects. That's where the stool sample comes in. It's super important in these cases.
Okay, so let's talk stool samples. The textbook mentions looking for blood and cysts. Why are those two things so important for cracking the case?
Well, you can think of it as a process of elimination. See, some bacteria, like certain types of E. coli or Salmonella, and even that protozoan Entamoeba histolytica, they often cause bloody diarrhea. Others, like most viruses, they usually don't. So if you find blood, it helps you rule out a bunch of suspects right away.
Makes sense. So blood points us in one direction, no blood points us in another. What about the cysts?
Cysts are kind of like a protozoan shield, a dormant, resistant form that some of these microbes can turn into. If you find cysts in the sample, it pretty much screams protozoan infection, like Giardia or Cryptosporidium.
Okay, so in Alex's case, his stool sample came back negative for both blood and cysts. So no blood, no cysts. How does that help us, or I guess the doctors in the story, get closer to figuring out what's wrong with them?
Right, well, it definitely narrows things down. No blood makes some of the usual suspects less likely. And since Alex was in Mexico, the doctor starts to think about one of the most common culprits for travelers' diarrhea, which is enterotoxigenic E. coli, or ETEC for short. It's notorious for causing, those exact symptoms.
But the doctor doesn't just stop at the symptoms and where he's been, right? The textbook talks about a very specific test to confirm if it's actually ETEC.
Oh, absolutely. To be completely sure, the doctor orders a genetic analysis of Alex's stool sample. They're looking for, the DNA fingerprints of ETEC, basically. Specifically, the genes that code for its unique weapons. Those are called virulence factors.
Hold on a second. Why did they go for this fancy genetic analysis instead of, say, trying to grow the bacteria in a lab or doing a gram stain? Wouldn't that be easier?
Well, you see, it all comes down to efficiency and accuracy. Isolating bacteria from a stool sample can take quite a while. And some bacteria can be really picky eaters, they just refuse to grow in the lab. And gram staining, while it can give us some clues, it can't really tell us the specific strain of bacteria we're dealing with. And in this case, knowing the specific strain is really important.
So it's like this genetic analysis is like having a super precise bacterial identification system.
Yeah, exactly. It lets us pinpoint the genes that make ETEC so good at causing all this trouble.
Speaking of trouble, the textbook keeps mentioning these virulence factors. What are those exactly? And for someone who's not, a microbiology whiz, what makes this ETEC different from the regular E. coli we hear about all the time?
So think of virulence factors like the bacteria's toolkit for causing disease. With ETEC, we have three major players to watch out for: LT, ST, and CF. They're kind of like the bad guys in this story.
Okay, let's break those down one by one. What are they?
So LT stands for heat-labile enterotoxin, and ST stands for heat-stable enterotoxin. Heat-labile just means it breaks down with heat, and heat-stable means it doesn't. The important thing is that both of these toxins, they mess with how your gut works.
So they're basically wreaking havoc on our insides. How do they actually do that?
Well, they interfere with how ions, particularly chloride ions, are moved around in your intestines. This whole disruption causes a ton of water to flow into the intestines, and that leads to, yep, you guessed it, watery diarrhea.
Ah, so that's how those toxins are connected to what Alex is experiencing. Okay, so we've covered LT and ST. What about CF? What role does that play in this microscopic drama?
Right, so CF, or colonization factor, it's a sneaky one. Imagine it like a hook that ETEC uses to grab onto the lining of your small intestine. Makes it a lot harder for your body to get rid of them.
So they're setting up shop and refusing to leave. Definitely sounds like a recipe for, well, gastrointestinal disaster.
Exactly. Those three virulence factors, they work together to create the perfect storm of symptoms we see in Alex's case. They're a real troublemaking trio. It's really fascinating how it all works together.
Yeah, so finally, the doctor gets the results back from that genetic analysis, right? And they can finally tell Alex exactly what he has. ETEC. Must be a relief to finally have an answer. But now the big question is, how do you actually treat something like that?
Right, so the stool sample confirms it's ETEC, no doubt about it. And as for treatment, well, the most important thing is to make sure Alex is staying hydrated, drinking plenty of fluids because he's losing a lot. But his symptoms weren't getting better very quickly, so the doctor decided to prescribe some ciprofloxacin.
Ciprofloxacin, that's an antibiotic, right?
Yes, exactly. It's a type of antibiotic called a fluoroquinolone. It's usually very effective against bacterial infections like ETEC. And in Alex's case, luckily, the ciprofloxacin worked like a charm. His symptoms cleared up in just a few days.
That's great news. But it makes you wonder, how did he even get infected with this ETEC in the first place? It's not like it just appears out of nowhere, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it brings up something super important about how to prevent foodborne illnesses, especially when you're traveling. Alex probably picked up that ETEC bacteria from some contaminated food or water during his trip to Mexico. It happens.
That makes sense. ETEC and traveler's diarrhea seem to go hand in hand, don't they? But why is that?
Well, in countries that are still industrializing, like Mexico, the sanitation practices might not be as developed, which can unfortunately lead to contamination of the food and water. It can happen during food handling, processing, or even from contact with contaminated water used to grow the food.
So it's not about the country itself, really, but more about how their sanitation systems are set up.
That's it. And as someone who loves to travel and see new places, it's something you always have to be aware of. So what can travelers do to protect themselves from these, let's call them unwanted microbial souvenirs?
Well, it sounds like being really careful about what you eat and drink is crucial, but what does that actually look like?
Being cautious about what you eat is a great start. Avoiding undercooked foods, especially meat, seafood, and veggies, is really important. And unpasteurized dairy products, those can be risky too.
Got it. So be careful with the food. What about the water? Is tap water totally off limits when you're traveling?
It's always better to be safe than sorry. Even ice cubes in the water you use to brush your teeth can be a source of contamination. So bottled water is definitely the safer choice in those cases.
Right. And of course, the golden rule. Always wash your hands.
Couldn't agree more. Washing your hands often and really well with soap and water is super important, especially before you eat or after using the restroom. It's one of the most effective ways to stop germs from spreading, including ETEC.
Simple, but essential. It just occurred to me, Alex's symptoms, they sound a lot like cholera, which is caused by a completely different bacterium, Vibrio cholerae. Is there any connection there?
Wow, you're picking up on some really interesting details. The symptoms of ETEC can be very similar to cholera. And there's actually a really cool evolutionary connection between the two. Remember those toxins we talked about, LT and ST? Well, scientists believe that way back in the evolutionary history of ETEC, a harmless strain of E. coli might have actually stolen the genes for those toxins from Vibrio cholerae.
Wait, bacteria can steal genes from each other? How is that even possible?
It's called horizontal gene transfer, and it happens more often than you might think in the bacterial world. It's one way bacteria can adapt and evolve, picking up new traits along the way, like, for example, antibiotic resistance, or in this case, the ability to produce toxins.
So basically, a harmless E. coli went out and got itself some bad boy genes and became ETEC.
That's a pretty good way to put it. And the way those toxin genes are structured in ETEC actually backs up this whole theory.
I'm intrigued. What's so special about how those genes are structured?
They're located on these things called plasmids.
Plasmids. Refresh my memory on those. What are they again?
Think of plasmids like little bonus loops of DNA. They're separate from the bacteria's main chromosome. They carry all sorts of extra genetic information. And the important thing is they can be easily passed between different bacteria.
So plasmids are like bacterial trading cards, swapping traits and abilities back and forth.
Huh. That's a great way to think about it. The fact that those genes for LT and ST are on these easily transferable plasmids in ETEC really supports the idea that they were acquired through horizontal gene transfer, probably from Vibrio cholerae, and they're still being passed around in bacterial populations today.
Wow. It's incredible how interconnected the microbial world really is. Makes you realize those microscopic players are constantly changing and adapting. It's a whole drama unfolding at that scale.
It really is. It's like an ongoing arms race, with both the hosts and the microbes trying to outmaneuver each other constantly. And if we want to come up with effective strategies to prevent and treat infectious diseases, we need to understand how those evolutionary processes work.
And speaking of treatment, we were talking about how ciprofloxacin helped Alex get better. But we also hear a lot about antibiotic resistance these days.
Yeah.
How does that factor into all of this?
That is a really crucial question. While antibiotics can be absolute lifesavers, like in Alex's case, using them too much or using them the wrong way has contributed to a huge problem, antibiotic resistance.
Right, it's like this constant battle with the bacteria always evolving to survive the drugs we use against them. And as a traveler, that's a little bit worrying, to be honest.
Absolutely. Antibiotic resistance is a major concern for global health. As bacteria become resistant to commonly used antibiotics, it becomes much harder to treat infections. That can mean longer illnesses, higher healthcare costs, and even higher mortality rates, which is scary.
So as travelers, what can we do to be responsible and help prevent antibiotic resistance from getting worse?
For starters, antibiotics should only be used when they're really necessary, and only when prescribed by a doctor. And it's just as important to always complete the full course of treatment. That way, you can prevent the emergence of resistant strains.
So no stopping early just because you're feeling better.
Exactly. But even more important is preventing these infections from happening in the first place. Simple things like safe food and water practices and being really diligent about hand washing can make a huge difference.
So prevention is key, both for our own health and for tackling this bigger problem of antibiotic resistance.
I completely agree. Investing in better sanitation systems around the world, promoting safe food handling practices, and educating travelers about how to prevent these infections, those are all crucial steps if we want to combat antibiotic resistance and protect public health.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. We started with a simple case of travelers' diarrhea and ended up talking about a global health crisis, all thanks to the amazing world of microbes. It really shows you how connected everything is.
What might seem like just an isolated case of food poisoning can actually have a huge impact on human health and how we approach antibiotic use in the future. It's much bigger than it seems at first. It really is. When you understand how these infections work, they seem a little less scary, you know?
Absolutely. It's like we're taking a peek behind the scenes of this whole invisible world. And we couldn't have solved this microbial mystery without the amazing OpenStax microbiology textbook. You can find the link in the video description if you want to explore this stuff even more.
It's a fantastic resource, really, for anyone who's curious about microbes and how they impact our lives.
Speaking of impact, this case, even though it's made up, shows how even a fun trip can turn into a microbiology lesson, right?
Yeah, definitely. It really shows how important it is to take those precautions, especially when you're traveling to places with different sanitation standards.
We've covered a lot today, but I'm left with this one question. Given that antibiotic resistance is becoming such a big problem and making a vaccine for ETEC is difficult, what does this mean for travelers in the long run? Especially for those going to places where sanitation isn't so great. It feels a little bit like a ticking time bomb, you know?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of the matter. As antibiotic resistance gets worse, we might end up with fewer and fewer options for treating infections that people pick up while traveling, especially in places where healthcare and access to those newer antibiotics aren't as good.
So it's not just about getting sick on your trip, but about what this means for everyone's health in the long term.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to talk about these things. It's a global problem, and we need a multi-pronged approach to solve it. We need to invest in research to find new antibiotics and vaccines, encourage people to use antibiotics responsibly, and improve sanitation systems everywhere.
It reminds us that our health is all connected. What happens in one part of the world can affect everyone else. And understanding how these microbes work is a huge part of keeping ourselves and future generations healthy.
Well said. And it's a call to action for everyone, really. We can each play a part in making the world healthier by making smart choices, supporting initiatives that are trying to address these challenges, and staying curious about the amazing world of microbes.
So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of microbiology.
Until next time.